Dr. Jennica Larrison is here to speak about a crisis that the U.S. government prefers not to discuss. And that goes for the governments of leading Western countries. 100 million people around the globe have either been terrorized or forced in some other way from their homes. 30 million of them are refugees and asylum seekers, political asylum seekers. They are outside their country of residence. And then the other 70 million are homeless, living within their countries. That is to say, they're internally displaced. It's a staggering number, and it's growing by 10 million a year. Where is the U.S. leadership in addressing this worldwide crisis? Well, some would say that the U.S. is leading backwards because we're all but closing our doors to genuine asylum seekers as they try to and of course, the U.S. government is preoccupied trying to manage the flood of mostly economic refugees at our southern border. Dr. Larrison knows a lot about the subject. She grew up in a West Texas town surrounded by migrants. This experience and the friendships she made and the local cuisine that developed out of it helped inspire a career in international affairs. And now she's an associate professor at the University of Baltimore's School of Public and International Affairs. She teaches courses on migration, global governance, and human security. She's also executive director of the school. Her teaching must be stellar. Last year, she won the teaching prize of the Maryland University Teaching System. It's awarded by the Board of Regents. I think there are only 4 people who will receive that in the whole university system. And student ratings describe her in glowing terms. I'll just give you 3 of them. Awesome, phenomenal, and brilliant. That's quite something to live up to.
I don't know how I'm going to go up there now.
Her degrees are from the University of Texas at Austin, the University of California at San Diego, and George Washington U. She's been a lecturer at GW and at Johns Hopkins SAIS, both in DC. She's worked at the World Bank as a specialist in human development. Dr. Larrison, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me this evening. I am thrilled to be here. And this evening I'm going to be talking about an incredibly important topic that will not be going away anytime soon, and that is forced migration, specifically the role of the international community and states in addressing it. At the onset here, I would like to say that each of these topics I'm going to discuss tonight could be an entire talk all on their own. So in that, I'm really trying to provide a broad overview of the situation, how we are failing our humanitarian obligations, and begin to think about a viable path forward. Let's see if I can get to the next slide. There we go. So I would like to begin this evening by telling you 3 distinct migration stories. These depict real events and individuals that have been reported on, but names, details have been adapted for tonight. I'll share with you a bit the reasons why they left their country and their journey to a new country. And then we'll back out a little bit and think more holistically about terminology, the scope of the issue currently and in the future, and the events really that are helping to drive displacement. We'll go back to the migration stories to really learn what these individuals faced in their new country, what current national policies look like, what current global policies look like, and what I think we could do. Finally, I will briefly discuss a number of organizations that are actively engaged in addressing these issues and working hard on this in Baltimore itself, and offer resources and assistance that are really helping refugees and opportunities then for you to get involved as well. So let's jump in. I'd like to start by telling you a story about Ana. Ana was forced to leave Venezuela due to escalating political and economic conflict that had engulfed the entire country. Inflation, scarcity of basic goods, unemployment, and widespread violence really made life unbearable for her and her family. They struggled to find food and medicine. This was exacerbated when her daughter, Elena, was born, and she could not find diapers or formula or any other basic necessities. Having attended many opposition protests, Ana had been blacklisted from her government job and no longer had employment. She lived in constant fear of her and Elena's safety. Her only family was her brother, but he had recently left and made the 1,900-mile trek to Peru. She wanted to join him, but he had explained that the situation in Peru was not a good option for her and Elena. Over 900,000 Venezuelans had moved to Peru in the last few years. And he originally thought that he would be able to move to Lima, find work, and begin again. What he discovered was that he was met with disdain and harassment, that it was not so easy to find work, and instead his time was marked by theft, harassment, a violent attack, all by individuals who really were plaguing vulnerable migrants that were living in the north of the city in Lima. Having been an accountant previously, he thought that he would be able to find work, and this was not what he expected, nor did he think that Ana should do it. She would not be able to practice law, and any work that she could get would not be enough to support her and Elena. So she promised she wouldn't go. But conditions worsened at home. She was convinced that if they stayed, they would not survive. A neighbor explained that she would be traveling to the United States. She had heard that Venezuelans were being allowed into the US. And she knew of a smuggler that could take them through the Darien Gap, the jungle between South America and Central America. But Ana had to act immediately. She took her daughter and left that night. She then became one of the 250,000 people in the last year to traverse this roadless area of sheer mountain, intense mud, jungle, and deadly animals known as the Darien Gap. Once in Colombia, she waited for her name to be called to get on a boat. She got off the boat on the other side of the Gulf in the nearest town to the jungle. She began her journey almost immediately, and the terrain was incredibly difficult. She watched as a woman fell down an extremely steep hill and began to see where people were dropping off of the path and off of the journey. By day 4, they reached Panama and the most difficult part of the trek, an area called the Hill of Death. Scaling tree roots taller than she was, she slipped and fell and twisted her ankle while carrying Elena. She continued on the path, but could see that it was getting more and more difficult, and the group was moving past her. So she asked a friend that she had met in the last few days if they would take Elena, and she would be behind. The friend agreed, took Elena, and after about a couple of hours, Ana lost sight of where they were. She was too slow, too injured to be able to keep up. So it was 3 days before Ana reached a boat that ultimately took her to a UN camp and reunited her with her daughter. They rested for a couple of days before heading north. They then paid for buses to get them through 5 countries in Central America and up through Mexico. So we'll come back to Ana's story and Ana's experience a little later in the talk. I'd now like to tell you a story about Farah. and her family. So Farah lived in a province heavily affected by the reemergence of the Taliban. The escalating violence and the imposition of strict Taliban rules made life unbearable for her family. Farah had been an outspoken journalist. Now she was not working, her girls' schools were closed, and they could not go out without male companionship. All basic freedoms were curtailed. One evening, their village was attacked by the Taliban, and disorder quickly took over. Gunshots echoed through the streets, and fear gripped the community. Realizing the immediate danger that they were in, Farah and Ahmad, her husband, made a swift decision to flee with their children, leaving behind everything they owned. Their journey to the Afghan-Pakistan border was treacherous. They traveled under the cover of darkness, avoiding Taliban checkpoints, and seeking refuge in homes of sympathetic villagers along the way. They walked for days, enduring exhaustion, hunger, and the constant fear of being discovered. They encountered hostile terrain, extreme weather, and the constant threat of violence from armed groups. They relied on the kindness of strangers for shelter and food, facing uncertainty at every step. Finally, after weeks of enduring hardships, Farah and her family arrived at the Afghan-Pakistan border. They were now 5 of the over 600,000 Afghans that had fled since the Taliban came back to power in August of 2021, and joined the other 3 million Afghan refugees already in Pakistan before 2021. And now I would like to tell you a story about Abdul and Fatima, who live in Myanmar. While tensions had ebbed and flowed between the Rohingya people living in the Rakhine state in Myanmar and the Myanmar military and government for years, in Abdul and Fatima's village, tensions had been escalating for months. They witnessed their neighbors being attacked and their homes being burned to the ground. One fateful day, their village was raided by armed forces, and chaos ensued. Amidst the chaos, Abdul and Fatima gathered their children and fled for their lives. They ran with their extended families, literally past death. The family embarked on a treacherous journey, navigating dense forests and crossing dangerous rivers to reach safety in Bangladesh. Not an unfamiliar story now that we're on the third one. They walked for days, enduring hunger, exhaustion, and constant fear of being caught or harmed. During the journey, their relatives became scattered as they joined the masses fleeing. They arrived in Bangladesh along with over 1.4 million Rohingya refugees who live in refugee camps in Cox's Bazar across 6.5 square miles in Bangladesh. And here you can see a map of where those are. There's a map here because the Rohingya didn't have passports. They don't have identification. Myanmar has never recognized them, and so they are not citizens. And so that there was no passport to put on this picture, so instead there is a map to explain where we are. So now we've heard these 3 distinct cases. I'd like us to step back a bit and look at the forced migration landscape globally. I want to start by understanding the myriad of terminology used across the discussion. First, refugee. The legal definition of refugee is enshrined in the United Nations 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, sometimes referred to as the Geneva Convention. The convention provided for 3 key pieces. It provided for a definition of what is a refugee, along with the provision for an exclusion from refugee status. It also provided for the legal status of refugees in their country of asylum. This is to say that they are protected from being sent back from refoulement. Bless you. And finally, it provided states' obligations to cooperate with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Thus, those recognized as refugees have a clear international legal status and are afforded the protection of the UNHCR. It's important to note that an individual is a refugee as soon as the criteria contained in the refugee definition is fulfilled. In other words, a person does not become a refugee because of a positive declaration that is given to them that they now are a refugee. The moment they meet that criteria, they are a refugee. Recognition of refugee status is declaratory. It confirms that the person is indeed a refugee. This distinction is important when we think about this next category of individuals, asylum seekers. The term asylum seekers is a general designation for individuals who are seeking international protection. While not every asylum seeker will ultimately be recognized as a refugee, under international law, asylum seekers should not be returned to their countries of origin until their claims have been examined. However, asylum seekers are often not included or substantially underrepresented in the global numbers that Roy was just talking about earlier, as their cases are being adjudicated across the world. And since they haven't yet reached that phase, we don't count them as part of refugees or as displaced, but it is indeed another large number to add to that. This brings us to internally displaced persons, or IDPs. These are individuals who have been forced from their homes for all the same reasons that we've previously discussed, but remain in their home country. As such, this displacement is not governed by international law, but we can see where IDPs could become refugees and therefore fall under the international law guidelines relatively easily by crossing an international border. And finally, the term that we have been talking about all evening that is generally used to refer to the movement of all individuals we've discussed, which is forced migration. So with this understanding of what forced migration is, let's look at some figures and the trajectory. In 2012, UNHCR called displacement the new 21st century challenge. Since that time, the number of displaced has increased dramatically. In 2012, we had 45 million displaced. 5 years later, it was 67.5 million. And 5 years later, in 2022, it was 103 million. If this rate of displacement continues, we are looking at near 200 million displaced in 10 years. This would make the displaced population the size of current-day Nigeria, or Brazil, or Pakistan. Moreover, estimates reach as high as 1.2 billion displaced globally by 2050 due to natural disasters and climate events. So it's incredibly important to stress that this is known displacement. This is the ones that we categorize. These are the numbers that we are able to tick. This is not all of the other individuals who are displaced but have not yet been recognized, because then the numbers would be much higher. So to give you a sense of where and what we are currently seeing, as of 2022, 7 out of 10 refugees under UNHCR's mandate originate from 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and South Sudan. 36% of refugees are hosted in 5 countries: Turkey, Colombia, Germany, Pakistan, and Uganda. 74% of refugees are hosted in low and middle income countries, with 22% being hosted in countries categorized as least developed. And 41% of forcibly displaced are children. So what is driving this increased displacement? What's happening? So drivers of forced migration include violence, ethnic and religious persecution, and armed conflict, but also extreme poverty, environmental factors, and large-scale development projects. Think when dams are built and displace indigenous communities. according to UNHCR, an annual average of 21.5 million people are forcibly displaced annually due to weather-related events since 2008. But as we saw in the stories that we were telling earlier, the drivers are not so clear-cut. Multiple drivers may intersect to force an individual to leave their home. As long as we have the circumstances that create refugees, we will have individuals coming to foreign borders requesting safe haven. And the drivers we speak about here are not going away. If anything, they will only intensify in the coming decades. We are seeing authoritarianism where we need internationalization. We are seeing domestic isolation when we need international cooperation. We cannot hide from what will continue to come. Increased climate events, food insecurity, conflict, and violence are all intertwined, and they will create increased numbers of people fleeing persecution and devastation. Climate in particular is a threat multiplier. From Darfur to Somalia, Iraq to Syria, climate change sows seeds of conflict and makes displacement that much more difficult when it happens. So I'd like to now go back and look at the cases from the beginning and see what we're doing about it. So when we left Anna and Elena earlier, they were traveling the bus network through Central America and Mexico. When they reached northern Mexico, Anna learned that the exception she had been told about, the one that allowed Venezuelan migrants to enter the US, had ended. The Biden administration saw what was happening too, right? Saw that this exception was pushing people into the Darien Gap and that many Venezuelans were headed to the US. So instead, a new policy was put into place to address Venezuelan migrants, one called humanitarian parole. In this case, if one meets a number of requirements, from having a passport to having a sponsor who lives in the United States that will financially support you for the first couple of months, Venezuelans are allowed to enter into the US when they meet all of these criteria. So Ana is currently in northern Mexico with Elena, hoping that they will successfully pursue this new path. So to understand Ana's situation and that of all seeking to enter the United States, I wanted to take a look a little bit at how the system has been designed to work and how the new immigration rules laid out by the Biden administration in the last couple of weeks affect this as well. So here you'll see at the top, option A on this slide is their traditional third-party resettlement path, whereby refugees, are vetted by UNHCR, the State Department, Homeland Security, before being offered resettlement into the United States. The US has currently set the resettlement ceiling at 125,000, meaning no more than 125,000 can be resettled in the United States in 1 year. Last year, with the ceiling in place, the US resettled just over 25,000 refugees, or 20% of this set threshold. Then you have option B. The affirmative asylum process is one where individuals fleeing persecution enter the US on a valid visa and request asylum. Option C is the process for arriving asylum seekers fleeing persecution who show up at the border and request asylum. This is what we're hearing all about in the news with the southern border. And option D is called the defensive asylum process, whereby individuals fleeing persecution gain a valid visa, a tourist visa, a student visa, come to the United States, overstay their visa, and then request assistance. So with the end of Title 42, the Biden administration has adopted 3 major changes to the asylum process. The first is that you're expected to seek asylum in external reception centers The first centers are to be developed in Guatemala and Colombia. These don't exist yet, but that's the first thing you're supposed to do right now. The second is to apply for an appointment. So if you do decide to make the journey and you do get to northern Mexico, then they've created an app. I think probably a lot of people in here experienced the creation of an app with COVID and how well that worked at the beginning, right? So it's not dissimilar, right? So what happens is the app only works in northern Mexico. So you can't plan, you have to get to northern Mexico. And then you try to get an appointment. That's what the app is for, is to get an appointment, to be able to enter and see about your case. The other piece that is now in place is that in order to use the app, in order to get an appointment, you have to demonstrate that you have applied for asylum in one of the countries that you have passed to get here, and you have been denied. Otherwise, you don't get an appointment. And then the third option, which is more the carrot for certain individuals, is humanitarian parole. And this is for citizens of Venezuela, Haiti, Cuba, and Nicaragua. If you meet the requirements that we were just talking about for Anna, right? So if you meet the requirements of having a valid passport, of having a financial sponsor in the United States, then you are potentially eligible for humanitarian parole and can then fly into the country once you receive that visa acceptance. So the key here too with the changes in the Biden administration's policy is that the big difference is if you attempt to enter illegally, you will be arrested, processed, quickly deported, and banned from the United States for 5 years. So you can no longer, if it's implemented, you can no longer come to the border and request asylum. It's not an option. And I'm happy to talk all about that later in Q&A too, if you're interested. So now I want to talk about Farah and her family. We left as they arrived at the Afghan-Pakistan border. Exhausted and traumatized, they hoped to find safety and the chance to rebuild their lives. They made their way to Karachi in hopes of finding work, but were forced to live under the radar. They had been hearing stories of Pakistani officials arresting refugees, putting them in prison, fining them, deporting them, and they were afraid to even leave their apartment, but they had to work. So Farah had been providing some domestic help, and Ahmed had been working on and off at a grocery store. But without documentation, they cannot access housing, open a bank account, seek medical assistance, work legally. Until they can get documentation confirming the refugee status, they can do little, but they cannot go back to Afghanistan either. So Pakistan originally provided amnesty for Afghans fleeing Taliban rule. However, now that has ended. It ended in December of 2022. And once your visa expires, you have to re-enter Afghanistan and get a new visa to go to Pakistan. Obviously, for most refugees, they wouldn't be there if that was an option. Pakistan is not a signatory of the Refugee Convention and therefore does not see itself as bound to its rules. Instead, it has invoked the Foreigners Act of 1946 to incarcerate, fine, and/or deport Afghans seeking asylum. However, non-refoulement is widely accepted to be a customary law binding in all states, meaning Pakistan would be expected to respect the non-refoulement principle. Pakistan has learned that there are other options and has erected a 1,600-mile fence along its border with Afghanistan. They have been in communication with UNHCR since 2021, but have not agreed to work with the agency to determine ways of identifying Afghan refugees or to seek solutions. So all Afghan refugees now that are entering do not have documentation, cannot be verified as refugees, and therefore have no access to any of the things we talked about previously, health, work. And then finally, we'll go back to Abdul and Fatima, Rahim and Yasmin. When they finally arrived in Bangladesh, there was a relief mixed with a sense of uncertainty. They found themselves among hundreds of thousands of other Rohingya refugees in overcrowded camps, living in makeshift shelters, and really struggling to access basic necessities like food, clean water, and healthcare. They encountered local communities and humanitarian organizations providing support, but the vast number of refugees strained available resources. Despite the difficulties, Abdul and Fatima were initially grateful for their relative safety in the camps and the hope of rebuilding their lives. However, as time has passed and the kids are growing up, they have become increasingly concerned for the kids' health, safety, and future. So Bangladesh views the situation as temporary, that this is not something that is going to be protracted, that Rohingya refugees should be sent back to Myanmar, should be repatriated into Myanmar. They have had talks off and on with Myanmar about repatriation. They are back on now, they were off. However, international organizations do not see that as a durable solution as long as the Rohingya are not recognized in Myanmar. So now let's turn to international law. As previously discussed, the main international laws governing refugee status and the treatment of refugees are the 1951 Geneva Convention and its 1967 Protocol. International human rights laws, these include the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention Against Torture, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and many, many more. And also, it's important to mention the Global Compact on Refugees, which was adopted at the UN in December 2018, with 181 countries voting in favor. It was intended to create a framework for responsibility sharing and recognizing the need for an international response. It is important to note that the US, along with Hungary, voted against the compact. There has also been some regional efforts to expand who a refugee is throughout the decades. The Organization of African Unity 1969 Convention, the Cartagena Declaration in Latin America, all expanded the definition of what is a refugee, and then efforts to address responsibilities, such as the EU's Charter of Fundamental Rights. However, in practice, countries have created barriers to employing the rights afforded to refugees in the Geneva Convention. This often takes the form of what the literature calls externalization, a strategy whereby wealthy states institute measures beyond their border to prevent or deter entry of individuals they think may seek asylum. So think of Biden's new policies to replace Title 42, right? Individuals are expected to apply at regional centers far away from our border. And if they make it to northern Mexico, they apply for an appointment through an app. These are externalization policies. In addition, countries that currently house large refugee populations are not even signatories to any of these UN treaties. So think Pakistan, Turkey, Lebanon, Bangladesh. And the compact has ultimately failed to shift responsibility sharing. At best, we see vague promises of support and a system of burden sharing, whereby countries in the global north pay countries in the global south to maintain refugees. Here, think of the 6 billion euros that the EU paid Turkey to keep Syrian refugees in Turkey. Law scholar James Hathaway makes the key distinction between burden sharing, where money is provided, and responsibility sharing, which is people-focused. This is an important distinction in how we think about addressing refugees. Because the fact is that none of these words, none of these policies matter if the actions and implementation do not follow. In practice, we are turning a blind eye to the refugee crisis. We are expecting a handful of countries in the global south to bear the responsibility and the burden. It is worth repeating that as long as we have the circumstances that create refugees, we will have individuals coming to borders requesting safe haven. And if the drivers that we spoke about previously, they're not going away. If anything, again, they will only intensify in the coming decades. Ideally, I could stand here and tell you that we could ensure that governments develop and implement a comprehensive strategy to address forced migration, that we could come together and strengthen our international legal frameworks and domestic frameworks to ensure that they comply. I don't realistically see this happening, but I'm not hopeless. I do see room for regional responsibility sharing, whereby states within a region or states that perceive to be connected to each other, think Ukraine and how the EU response, can come together to have binding regional responsibility sharing. There is still some room for global burden sharing, and I hope room to increase the extra regional resettlement options for refugees, both in terms of countries and in terms of numbers. So I see us as incredibly fortunate in Baltimore to have a number of agencies and organizations that approach this from a humanistic perspective. Here, I've put just a few of the organizations that are active in Baltimore City, addressing the real needs of individuals on the ground. I know we have members in the audience tonight that work deeply on these issues, and I welcome their perspectives in addition to what is listed here. I wanted to end on a slightly more positive note, or at least an active note. So in discussing what we can do, and we can play an important role in assisting forced migrants. We can volunteer our time with one of the many organizations in Baltimore City, providing either general assistance or providing job training or language training. We can advocate for the protections that are already enshrined in international law, that they must be respected. We can do that to our elected officials through protests, by sharing information on social media, which can help to raise awareness and push for policy change. We can support forced migrants by providing a friendly face, assistance with translation, providing emotional support. We can organize through things like Airbnb's open home program to help individuals host forced migrants or provide a spare room. And ultimately, the organizations doing the hard work are underfunded, and donations are always welcome. So with that, I would like to say, again, thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to discussing with you further.
So what should the United States do? If you look at the ultimate issue, it is how to place, how can all these refugees and even internal migrants find a home? Where does the United States come in? This is a country that is built on refugees. And every one of us probably has some story about ancestors. What should the United States do if you could offer Joe Biden advice, which he might not want to hear? What is the unpleasant advice that we should give him?
He's between a rock and a hard place right now.
Yeah.
I said the first thing we need to address is the backlog in immigration courts. The fact that to seek asylum, it takes over 5 years to do so is a significant issue on both sides of the coin, because what it does is it also incentivizes individuals who are not seeking asylum to claim asylum to have 5 years in the country before they are deported. What that means is there are that many more individuals who are here, so all of the individuals that are truly seeking asylum have to wait that much longer in order to get asylum and to really begin to build anew. The immigration court backlog is staggering, and that's where I would start.
But the numbers that are coming in
Yeah.
are minuscule. What should be done there? I mean, leaving aside the current debate, what should the U.S. be doing to lead, not just in North America, but all of its allies and friends around the world?
Well, we expect countries like Lebanon to take 25% of their population in refugees. Again, I think I told you we accepted 25,000 in a country of over 350 million. That is a significant humanitarian concern. There is obviously I'm not going to pretend there's not a saturation point at some point, but we have nowhere near hit it. And if we don't get this addressed now, then in 15, 20 years, when we're really seeing massive numbers at our border, all of those other drivers that I discussed, the conflict and the environment and all those pieces, we're going to be experiencing here too.
8.5 worldwide now, 8.5 billion 2030, 9.7 2050, 10.4
Yep.
in 2100.
Yep.
That just seems to be the basic driver to me. When you think about climate change, what's driving greenhouse gases? Population growth. So that's another big question. I don't know how you want to address it, but what do we do about population growth?
Well, and the population grows as the habitable land decreases, right, in the next 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
So the habitable land on Earth decreases in the next 30 or 40 years with climate change, while the population continues to
Just
explode.
exacerbates it.
Yes, 100%. I mean, and that's where you have had, across the last 40 years, you have had all sorts of development and reproductive plans to try and address that growth. And what you do have, which is also important that we don't talk about that I hadn't talked about here, is that you have a lot of countries with aging societies who will need youth and workers to come to the country to maintain their GDP. So that's another piece of the demographic. While you have countries that are dramatically continuing to grow, for example, by 2040, it was 2050, I think it's earlier now, Nigeria is expected to be more populous than the United States. It will become number 3. So while you have countries that continue to grow, you also have largely global north countries who are aging because they put in place 50 years ago different reproductive plans that are going to require that labor. And so keeping it out is somewhat short-sighted in the long term.
So I have a question here from our Zoom audience. Sam Dell, one of the members of our Board of Trustees, had tried to help Venezuelans and Afghans in either resettlement or just in support. He said, after many hours of trying, I concluded that the only thing, and he went to various NGOs here in Baltimore, the only thing that the NGO aid agencies were interested in, the only thing they were interested in was cash. He said there was no straightforward way to donate material goods or even housing. Just give money was the answer. It seems to me that the NGOs are more interested in perpetuating their role and the need for it. Full employment for NGOs. So please comment. In other words, are NGOs doing their job? Are they, or have they been were they dismantled and weakened during the Trump administration to the point that they're not able to really stand up and do that job?
So I want to answer him directly, and then I will answer that question as well. I went back to this first slide and put my email address here because I am happy to point you to organizations that need drivers, that need airport pickups, that need assistance and help that is physical and not monetary. So again, my email is jlarrison@ubalt.edu, and we can have that conversation, and I can find the ways for you to assist. In terms of the role of NGOs, two things have happened. Certainly in terms of those that are assisting refugees. To your point, Roy, under the Trump administration, the ceiling that we talked about of 125,000 was decimated to almost zero. To bring it back up, that doesn't just happen overnight. The refugee organizations that are funded by the government become dismantled as well because they have no financing. They can't pay their employees. So what happens is when you have this yo-yo of what the ceiling is and what we'll expect and what we'll do, that capacity doesn't stay. It has to be rebuilt. It gets destroyed and then it has to be rebuilt. And so what needs to happen is some stability to be able to allow these organizations to do the job that they want to do.
I was wondering, could you comment a little about the American withdrawal from Afghanistan in terms of people who volunteered with the American Army and translators and whatnot, and if you think that could have been handled in a better way, and if so, what would you have done differently compared to what was actually done?
Yeah, no, thank you. I will first say that is not my area of expertise, but I will still answer a little bit, which is to say that the special immigrant visas that were given or were to be given were just woefully undergiven. So what you had was individuals who had worked, I'm sure you're all familiar, individuals who had worked with the United States government who were supposed to receive special immigrant visas because their lives were in danger for the work that they did for us. I have worked with, my experience on that is more personal than academic, because I have worked with several of Afghan refugees who were translators for the US government. But we failed dramatically from my perspective on this. For both those who worked with us in Iraq and in Afghanistan, because we left so many people without a pathway to get out. In terms of, I don't want to get into military politics because that is far from what I do. So I don't want to talk about our push out of Afghanistan, but I will say that it wasn't unknown that this was going to be the case, right? So significantly more planning to be able to address it would have been useful across the board.
Let me give another question from another member of our Board of Trustees. Stephen David is professor at Johns Hopkins. He said it appears he's sympathetic to the needs of refugees, but it appears that many people claim asylum when they are simply seeking a better life in the U.S. While I'm sympathetic, I'm worried that legitimate asylum seekers are not getting a fair hearing. Your view?
So that's exactly what we just talked about, right? Was that does exist, and it does create a backlog for asylum seekers that are truly fleeing persecution. I think one of the pieces that has gotten much messier is that it's not so clear whether you're an economic migrant or you're fleeing persecution, right? That it has become so muddled in the sense that that is one factor, but then there are also all these other factors that come together to force that decision to be made. And that's why it becomes so intractable and intransigent and difficult to address, because defining now is becoming harder and harder as well.
That's simple. Now, with this present crisis, a lot of proposal I heard like by state to issue work visa, which is easy little bit problem, but there no one wants to talk about that. But in the end, I want to share something what said one Kenyan comedian. I don't know her name, but I remember what she said. She said, thinking about Britain, you occupied us 200 years ago and shipped us everywhere. Today, we are paying for shipping, you are complaining.
Thank you for sharing. Yes.
Let me give you a question from Robert Friedman, another of our board members. Turkey wants to push the Syrian refugees back to a very uncertain future. What can the U.S. do about it?
So
Especially since Turkey is not a party to the Refugee Convention.
well, I want to answer that in a twofold way to kind of respond to the previous comment as well. And to say that, just lost my entire train of thought. So we're going to start over and I'm going to answer that question and I'll come back to the other one. What the United States can do to push Turkey to not return them, the United States doesn't have a lot in its arsenal that it can do. What I wanted to mention, I knew it would come back to me. What I wanted to say is that what needs to happen in these processes at the beginning, what has happened in Turkey is that the Turkish population feel that the refugees have more benefits, that they're allotted to things that the Turkish population is not, and that is unfair. And that is a real sentiment that we will see across the globe. What has to happen is we have to address local domestic populations along with our refugee populations. That it cannot be one and not the other in either direction. We have to address both in tandem together to move forward.
So is Turkey breaking the international, let's say, the unstated law,
The non-refoulement law, if they push them back to Syria, yes. The question for the EU becomes, do they push them back to Syria or do they allow them to move northern?
Not just the US, but every country has to do with public perception, right? Democracy or not, if the public perceives the powers that be as against the people, with whatever that means, some kind of revolt will happen, right? So with immigration in general, it's become a little bit of a dirty word, right?
Absolutely.
And so with public perception, you were saying that the numbers were 2,500 in comparison to the 125,000 that we can, allow in. How do you think, or what do you think would be the main factor, could be the main factor, we're not fortune tellers, of how to change the public perception about immigration of, yes, there are set limits, and yes, there are a lot of factors into it, but given that the public isn't coming from an academic place, right? They're coming from a more emotional place, right? So
Yeah.
how can we reach the public with that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because we've reached the public with the alternative narrative, right? We've reached the public with the fear-mongering narrative, and that the terminology even that we use, which is why I went through the terminology, because the terminology that we use to describe a situation can immediately, in this topic, immediately tells me where you sit on the topic, right? And not just the idea of illegal immigrants. People aren't actually illegal. They crossed illegally, yes, but a person can't be illegal, right? So whether we use terms like illegal immigrant versus undocumented migrant, but even it's much more pervasive than that. Even if we talk about the surge right? When we use terms to dehumanize migrants, we can't be surprised when they're dehumanized, right? So the trick is to shift the narrative in how we speak at every turn, how news agencies speak, what is being written in newspapers, even newspapers who maybe you would assume would be perhaps slightly more sympathetic, still talk about these in non-human terms about the situation. So I think the first step, and I think the one way to do it is to begin to humanize rather than dehumanize. So like telling the 3 stories this evening, right? It puts real names and real ideas and real journeys to what is otherwise this really high-level topic that can just be these 600,000 people or these 1.4 million, but instead these are actual real people that we're dealing with. I think like many things in this country, exposure is one of the best ways to shift the narrative. So once you know someone who is a refugee, once you're like, oh, but not that person, oh, but not that person, oh, wait, these people are, oh, wait, we need, and that, I think history has told us in this country that that is the quickest way to shift a narrative. And perhaps if we do have an opening and an increase, we can have the opportunity, there no doubt will be a backlash first, but an opportunity to then provide a more humanistic approach to the situation.
Moving forward, how will the international community address this? Should they, and how should they address this? Should they address the country of origin, or assist only in the new country's borders?
Yeah, so you have to address, and thank you for that, Alina, you have to address the root causes of the situation, right? You cannot address or put Band-Aids solely on the symptoms because it will never be resolved. It's the point of it doesn't matter what policies we put in place in this country, people are still going to come because they're not coming to this country. They have to leave where they are, and that's not an option. And so they leave where they are, and then we'll figure it out. But there's not an option to stay. So we have to look at this from a human security perspective of really addressing the root causes of the issue, thinking holistically about human security from access and affordability of health in origin countries, access and affordability of education, access to safe communities, access to safe political environments, ability to work and have a labor market. All of these pieces have to be taken into consideration. Under the Obama administration, we heard about this surge of unaccompanied migrant children, right, that were coming to the United States. And one of the policies that was put in place under that administration was through USAID to create development projects in the Northern Triangle. And particularly in El Salvador, because at the time, the majority of youth were coming from El Salvador. What we saw through those projects is the decline in the number of unaccompanied migrant children coming from El Salvador precipitously, that really began to take effect due to the work that was being done within El Salvador. We had a change in administration and all of that work ceased. None of it was funded and it all ended. But we do need to address 100% the situation in the country of origin as well as the country of reception.
And how would that apply in the case of Venezuela and Syria?
Yeah, so.
And we could do Afghanistan as well.
Well, and so that is where you have to have, it's already happened, right? How do you resolve where we are? The key here is to be proactive and try to create situations that resolve this before it happens, because once it happens, I think if anyone knew how to resolve it, it would be resolved.
Problem is what's happening in the area they're coming from. And during the Cold War, and even decades before that, American foreign policy in Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, has been love the landowners and their militaries while they keep down the populations lest they become communists. Is that still going on? Does the United States still ally itself with the landowners and the wealthy and the military? The picture you've been showing, something is seriously wrong for those people to be leaving. What's our current policy with us and trying to get the leadership of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala to become more democratic? I think we got to get rid of them if it takes the 82nd Airborne Division.
We got involved in the first place, yes, which was the problem, right? I mean, you think about this issue. I was going to say, when you first started, I was like, you're preaching to the choir here, you're preaching to the choir, because when you think about this issue, what has happened is we have sowed and we have created all of the destruction that we see in the Northern Triangle. And then we have, not only in the ways of which, you know, the war on drugs and the different pieces there, but also then we had individuals in the United States that were in gangs, went to prison, had never been to their home countries in Central America, but we deported them there. And then we deported the gang problem to Central America, which didn't exist. And then we deport that, and then we have individuals who are fleeing all of the violence that we created, and we say, oh, no, you can't come in. I'm sorry. You can't do that. So yeah, it is a real problem. I would argue that our any type of engagement that is forced is not the answer, but that we do need to be working again to address the root problems, which are also political in those countries.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Back to that, many times when we look at immigrants and refugees, asylum seekers, we tend to look at them, like compartmentalize them as just people who are seeking opportunities, not necessarily thinking about the fact that these are people with skill sets, talents, they have professions that could be really useful to the country of destination. So I know that a database is not something that would be very practical because of the sometimes clandestine nature of why they left their home countries. But how can we leverage the skill sets of immigrants, especially forced immigrants, while they're in the waiting process?
What we need to be doing is making the adaptation of the training that they already have, the skills that they already have, make it easy to adapt that into the United States so that we don't have healthcare workers who are doing domestic work, so that we don't have doctors who are picking fruit, right? We need to ensure that the certifications, and that sounds like an exaggeration, but it's not. We need to ensure that the certifications and the training and the skills that individuals have invested in themselves and want to use in a new country can be used. And I recognize that there are a lot of arguments of proof and these different pieces, but there are ways to address that, and much quicker than saying, oh, you have to go back to med school in the United States. That's not helpful. So if we can really leverage all of the skills that individuals have for economic development, I mean, that's one of the major plans of the mayor of this city, right? So if we can do that, then it also addresses back to the earlier question about the framing and how we frame this. If we can frame it in such a way that we are building a community and actually working together to ensure that the community itself is functioning and safe and clear and happy.
Would you like to sum up some advice for Joe Biden?
You keep wanting me to give
What
him
are
some
the-
advice,
what are the-
right?
What are the 3 top priorities he should set?
With where he is now.
Yeah.
So I think the first is to address refugees coming into the country. What we have been doing for the last few years is saying we have too large of a problem at the southern border, and therefore we can't address refugees. That's got to stop. That's got to stop. We address, we commit, and we fulfill our obligations that we have previously made, and we accept the refugees, not asking to increase it at this point because that would be too much, but actually accept the 125,000 refugees that we set a ceiling to accept. So addressing the refugee concern as a starter would be the piece. The main concern all comes at the southern border, right? And it's a real concern because what is happening now is all of those rules that I said are in place. There are tens of thousands of migrants, many asylum seekers, some that are not, that are traveling and trying to get to the U.S. border. There are many that are in northern Mexico in some place trying to regroup and figure out what to do. I don't underestimate that it's a real concern. And then on top of that, what you have is what we tend to forget as well is that all of these individuals, again, are not a number. They're rational human beings. They're watching to see what's happening. They're trying to figure out what's the best option for them, what they need to do, where they need to go. And if they see that the rules that have been set in place are not actually being implemented, then you will see a significant increase again at the southern border. And I think that is one of the largest concerns that the Biden administration actually has right now, is can they get individuals on deportation flights quick enough? The answer on that side is to, again, I would argue, always err on the side of human nature and humanistic perspectives, and begin to think about the ways to address where we are actually now. The reception centers in Guatemala and Colombia, if that's the policy, then they need to be up and running. That can't be a policy when they don't exist, right? So if you need to be able to actually implement the things that you're saying you're doing, otherwise it continues to create an even larger significant problem down the road.
Well, thank you so much, Jennica. That was an excellent presentation.